You're listening to the free audiobook, The Old Man in the Alps and the Sieve of Doom, a story composed one evening when I really couldn't be bothered. Narrated by 11 Labs. Written by Lefki Karantoni. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. The Void Between the Mesh. High above Verbier in the Swiss Alps, where the air tasted of pine needles and regret, lived Klaus Gruber. He was 87 years old, he had a wiry beard, and a face that had permanently settled into the expression of mild disappointment for every single thing since 1953. His chalet, Zum Alten Fürz, named after his late goat, clung to the mountainside like a stubborn limpet. Inside, everything was carved wood, cowbells, and the faint smell of old cheese and deeper resentment. Klaus spoke to no one except his cuckoo clock, his one remaining tooth, and occasionally the mountain itself when it dared to avalanche near his woodpile. One frostbitten Tuesday, while rummaging through a box of his late wife's fancy kitchen nonsense, Klaus found it. The sieve. It was not a normal sieve. This one was wrought iron, blackened with age, its mesh impossibly fine. Around the rim were tiny, half-erased runes that seemed as if they'd been scratched in by something with claws. On the handle, in faded Gothic lettering, were the words Sieve des Untergangs. Klaus squinted at it. "Pah, Touristat," he grumbled and tossed it onto the kitchen table. The moment the sieve touched the scarred oak, every single hole in its mesh began to glow a malevolent, cheddar-coloured orange. A low whisper slithered out. "Finally. Free. Feed me. The world." Klaus blinked once, then the sieve leapt. It latched onto the sack of flour on the counter like a metallic lamprey. In under 4 seconds, it had sieved the entire 20-kilo bag into a perfect, hovering sphere of ultra-fine powder that began orbiting the sieve. Klaus took his pipe out of his mouth. Scheisse. The sieve of doom spun faster. The flour sphere exploded outward in a perfect white vortex, coating the entire kitchen in a blizzard of pastry-grade doom. From within the storm, the sieve's voice rose to a triumphant cackle. "I shall sieve the mountains. I shall sieve the sky. I shall sieve reality itself into perfect, uniform particles." Klaus grabbed the nearest weapon, a heavy copper fondue fork, and snarled the sacred words of every Swiss mountain man since time began. Right, that's enough of that nonsense. The fondue fork missed the sieve by a good half-metre. Klaus blamed the flour in his eyes. The sieve blamed evolution. "Pathetic," it hissed, spinning lazily above the stove like a demonic frisbee. "You fight with cheese implements. I was forged in the volcanic fires beneath Lake Lucerne by a monk who had been excommunicated for crimes against pasta. I don't care if you were forged by the Pope's grandmother." Klaus seized a cast-iron skillet from the wall. Hildegard, he called her, after his second wife, on account of the weight and the tendency to leave a mark. "You are in my kitchen. You will behave." The sieve paused mid-spin, as if genuinely considering this. Then it shot straight through the kitchen window. Glass exploded outward into the freezing alpine morning. It hung in the air outside, silhouetted against the jagged alpine peaks, and began to vibrate at a frequency that made Klaus's single tooth ache. "Phase 1, the sieve announced to no one in particular. The snowpack. It dove. It hit the nearest snowdrift at speed and began sieving with terrible mechanical joy. Snow went in chunky and came out as a fine crystalline powder so impossibly uniform it made commercial icing sugar look like gravel. The powder rose in a vast glittering column that turned the entire mountainside the colour of a migraine. From inside his ruined kitchen, Klaus watched the column rise through the shattered window. He took a slow pull on his pipe. The tobacco had gone out. He relit it. Helga would have loved this, he muttered, referring to his fourth and final wife and her well-documented adoration for catastrophe. Absolutely loved it. He reached above the fireplace and took down the one item he had sworn never to touch again, his late father's alphorn. It was 2.5 meters of ancient pine held together by spite, beeswax, and a single strip of electrical tape applied in 1978. Klaus hadn't played it since the incident at the Interlaken Folk Festival of 1991, which had resulted in a rock slide, 2 injured yodelers, and a lifetime ban from the canton of Bern. He carried it to the broken window, wedged the bell end against the frame, and took a breath so deep his ribs audibly protested. "You want to sieve my mountain?" he growled around the mouthpiece. "Let's see how you handle the resonant frequency of a man who has nothing left to lose." The first note blasted out of the alphorn as though the mountain itself cleared its throat after a century of smoking. Brrrr. It was less music and more geological violence given auditory form. Windows in Verbier rattled far below. 3 chamois on a nearby ridge simply fainted on the spot. The sieve of doom, hovering above its glittering column of powdered snow, wobbled in mid-air. "Cease that infernal!" the sieve shrieked, but the second note hit it like a freight train. "On!" The fine snow powder detonated outward in a perfect spherical shockwave. The sieve spun wildly, its ancient runes flashing in panic as it tried to sieve the sound itself. Tiny particles of pure resonance began orbiting it in chaotic rings. Klaus's face turned beetroot. Veins stood out on his neck, but he kept blowing, cheeks puffed out. Down in the valley, avalanche warning sirens began howling in protest. A helicopter doing tourist flights banked hard and fled. The Sieve of Doom screamed, a high metallic keen that sounded like every Italian grandmother who had ever over-sieved her semolina. "Primitive analog weapon! You dare use analog against the future of uniform particle size?" It dove toward Klaus. Klaus yanked the alphorn back inside just in time. The sieve shot through the window frame, missed his head by centimeters, and embedded itself halfway into the table. For a moment both of them were still. Klaus lowered the alphorn, breathing like a broken steam engine. "You finished?" The sieve twitched. Its mesh glowed an angry fondue orange. "Phase 2, it hissed, voice now distorted and crackling. "The livestock." Outside, the distant tinkle of cowbells suddenly changed pitch, becoming higher, faster, more scared. The sieve shot out of the table and rocketed down the mountainside toward old Muller's herd. Klaus watched it go, then looked at the alphorn, then at the shattered window, then at the half-sieved kitchen. He spat on the floor. "Fine," he growled, "if it wants a proper alpine war." He shuffled over to the cellar door, yanked it open, and stared down into the darkness. From below came the low, ominous clank of something ancient, heavy, and definitely not supposed to be woken up. Time to get the big one. Chapter 2. The Emperor Cheese. Klaus descended the cellar stairs carefully, knowing exactly which step would betray him. The third one. Always the third one. Brigitte, his third wife, had gone through it in 1997 and hadn't spoken to him for a week, which he still regarded as the happiest 7 days of his life. The cellar smelled of damp stone, aged Gruyere, and decisions made during wartime. He pulled a cord. A single bare bulb flickered on, illuminating rows of dusty shelves lined with unlabelled preserves, a truly suspicious number of empty Kirsch bottles, and, in the far corner, draped in a moth-eaten Swiss Army blanket, something enormous. Klaus pulled the blanket off. It was a cheese wheel, not a normal cheese wheel. This was the Kaiserkäse, the Emperor cheese, a 200-kilo round of Emmentaler so old it had developed its own gravitational field. His grandfather had made it in 1923 as a bet. His father had aged it out of stubbornness, and Klaus had inherited it out of spite. Nobody had ever eaten any. Nobody had ever dared. The holes in it were so large and so deep, they seemed to contain weather systems. A faint, golden light pulsed from its rind. "I swore I'd never roll you out," Klaus muttered, resting one gnarled hand on the ancient rind. It was warm. Not after what happened in Grindelwald. The cheese said nothing, because it was cheese, but it hummed. A low, resonant, lactose-based hum that made the preserves rattle on their shelves. From outside came a sound that made Klaus's blood curdle, which, given the context, felt thematically appropriate. Old Müller's cows were screaming, not mooing, screaming. The high, bovine shriek of cattle being sieved against their will. Klaus looked at the Kaiserkäse. The Kaiserkäse looked at Klaus. This was, of course, impossible, but Klaus had lived 87 years in the Alps, and he had learned that impossible was just a word used by people who lived below the tree line. "Right," he said, spitting on his palms. "Let's roll." He braced his shoulder against the great wheel and pushed. It didn't budge. He pushed harder. His spine made the sound of a xylophone being played by an angry child. "Gott im Himmel," he wheezed. "You've put on weight." He disappeared behind the shelves and returned with a bottle of Kirsch which he drank, and a crowbar which he applied to the wooden cradle holding the cheese in place. 3 savage wrenches and the cradle splintered. The Kaiserkäse began to move. Slowly at first, a glacial, majestic rotation. Then faster. It hit the cellar floor with a thoom that registered on seismographs in Bern. It rolled towards the stairs with the unstoppable momentum of a century of fermented indifference. Klaus flattened himself against the wall as it passed. Doors too narrow, he realised, a half-second before the Kaiserkäse solved the problem by removing the door, the frame, and a significant portion of the supporting wall from existence. Daylight flooded the cellar. Cold alpine air rushed in. The cheese rolled out onto the mountainside, gathering speed, trailing a faint golden glow and the scent of something that had transcended dairy a long time ago. Klaus climbed through the hole where his wall used to be, crowbar in one hand, pipe clenched between his gums, and watched the Kaiserkäse thunder downhill to old Müller's pasture, divine judgment wrapped in rind. "Sieve that, you metal bastard!" Down in the pasture, the sieve of doom was having the time of its life. It had corralled 3 of old Müller's prized Simmentals and was sieving their spots off. A neat, perfectly uniform pile of black cow patches was already forming on the grass, while the cows themselves looked on with profound, spotless indignity. "Uniformity!" the sieve shrieked, vibrating so fast it hummed, All must be equal. All must be fine. Then the ground began to shake. The sieve paused, pivoting its handle. Coming down the alpine slope was the Kaiser case. It had gained momentum, flattening pine saplings and launching startled marmots into the stratosphere. The golden glow from its rind was now blinding, catching the crisp morning sun and reflecting it with the intensity of a dairy-based laser. "What is this?" the sieve hissed. "Unpasteurized anomaly detected." It abandoned the spotless cows and flew upwards, positioning itself directly in the cheese's path. Its ancient iron mesh flared an aggressive molten orange. "I am the sieve of doom," it bellowed. "I reduce all to dust. Come to me, giant curd, and be processed." The Kaiserkäse did not slow down. It hit a rocky outcrop, launched itself 15 meters into the air, and descended upon the sieve, a majestic, pungent eclipse. The sieve braced itself, expanding its magical mesh to catch the behemoth. Clang! The sound echoed across the valley. The sieve did not sieve the Kaiserkäse. Instead, it became wedged inside one of the cheese's massive weather system-containing holes. "Unacceptable," the sieve muffled from deep within the Emmentaler cavern. "Density exceeds maximum parameters. I cannot process this level of mature flavor." The cheese hit the ground, sieve securely trapped inside, and continued its relentless roll. Now, however, it was a 200-kilo cheese wheel with a furious, glowing iron handle protruding from one side, acting as an asymmetric pivot. It began to bounce. Up on the ruined ledge of his chalet, Klaus adjusted his pipe. He pulled a pair of battered binoculars from his braces and peered down the mountain. The cheese was now taking erratic 50-meter leaps, ricocheting off boulders and heading straight towards the luxury ski resort of Verbier. Every time it hit the ground, a muffled scream of insolent lactose echoed from within. Klaus nodded slowly. "Good trajectory," he murmured, "but it's going to need a bit of steering." He turned back to the wreckage of his home. His eyes settled on his late grandfather's toboggan, a wooden contraption built in the 1890s, entirely devoid of brakes and held together by the same stubbornness that ran in the Gruber bloodline. "Right," Klaus sighed, pulling his woolly hat hard over his ears. "Let's go catch a cheese." Klaus hadn't sat on the toboggan since 1986. The toboggan remembered. It creaked beneath him with the wounded reproach of furniture that had been promised retirement. "Shut up," Klaus told it and shoved off. The first 3 seconds were deceptively gentle, a slow, crunching glide across the compacted snow outside what remained of his front door. Then gravity remembered its job. The toboggan hit the slope proper and Klaus's stomach relocated to somewhere behind his kidneys. The wind slammed into his face with the force of a personal vendetta. His beard streamed behind him, a grey, wiry pennant of war. His tooth vibrated at a frequency that suggested it, too, was considering resignation. Below him, the Kaiserkäse was carving a path of magnificent destruction. It had already flattened Müller's fence, redistributed a woodpile across 3 postcodes, and was currently airborne over a frozen stream, trailing a golden contrail and the muffled, increasingly hysterical protests of its trapped passenger. "Release me, you bloated wheel of tyranny!" the sieve shrieked from inside the hole, its voice reverberating through the cheese's internal structure and emerging as a deep yodel. "I was not designed for dairy imprisonment." Klaus leaned hard left. The toboggan responded with a savage turn that would have killed a younger man but merely insulted Klaus. He shot between two pines, clipped a startled postbox and dropped onto the main path just as the Kaiserkäse bounced off a ski lift pylon with a resonant bong that set off car alarms as far away as Martigny. He was gaining. The cheese was powerful, but it was round. It had no concept of trajectory, only momentum. Klaus, on the other hand, had spent 60 years navigating these slopes on vehicles that predated the concept of safety. He knew every rock, every dip, every frozen cow pat. He was not fast. He was efficient. The toboggan screamed beneath him, literally screamed. A high wooden shriek of timber under impossible stress. Klaus ignored it the way he ignored most complaints. Ahead, the outskirts of Verbier were approaching at a speed that suggested the resort had roughly 90 seconds to make its peace with God. The Kaiserkäse smashed through a decorative wooden sign reading, Bienvenue à Verbier. Luxury awaits and obliterated a rack of rental skis outside a boutique chalet. Designer poles scattered like expensive matchsticks. From somewhere inside the cheese, the sieve let out a noise that might have been a sob. I just wanted uniform particle distribution, it whimpered. Was that so much to ask? Klaus didn't answer. He was too busy aiming the toboggan at a snowbank that formed a natural ramp directly ahead. A beautiful, steep, stupid ramp that pointed at the sky. He hit it at full speed. The toboggan launched. Klaus left the seat entirely, hanging in the freezing air for one glorious, eternal second. An 87-year-old man on a 130-year-old toboggan, silhouetted against the Swiss sky, pipe still clenched in his teeth, crowbar raised overhead like Excalibur. He landed on the Kaiserkäse. The impact drove the air from his lungs and the pipe from his mouth. The cheese barely noticed. It was, after all, 200 kilos of Emmentaler that had transcended the concept of giving a damn. Klaus jammed the crowbar into the rind and held on. Now then, he growled, peering down into the hole where the sieve's handle protruded. You and I are going to have a little talk about what happens to kitchen utensils that don't know their place. Chapter 3. Le fromage d'or. You're mad, the sieve shrieked. You're a madman on a dairy meteorite. Klaus grunted, adjusting his grip on the crowbar. The sieve's runes were burning through the cheese from within. Another minute, and it would be free. The cheese was currently hurtling down Verbier's pristine main promenade, ignoring the pedestrianised zone. Ahead lay Le Fromage d'Or, an establishment where tourists paid €400 to dip stale bread into melted Gruyère while wearing designer ski boots. Klaus dug his heel into the rind, leaning his entire body. The Kaiserkäse veered sharply right, mounting the pavement and shattering the restaurant's immaculate glass double doors with a spectacular crash. The après-ski crowd, a mix of minor European royals and tech billionaires, froze mid-sip. A horrified hush fell over the dining room, broken only by the rumbling thoom, thoom, thoom of the ancient Emmentaler, navigating the plush carpeting. Bargain! The sieve yelled, panicking as the immense heat of the restaurant's central fireplace drew nearer. I can sieve you gold. I can sieve your wrinkles away. I can make you young. I don't want to be young, Klaus barked, steering the cheese narrowly past a trolley of vintage champagne. Young people don't know how to complain properly. He wrenched the crowbar upward with a primal roar. The Kaiserkäse launched off a raised dining platform, sailed majestically over a Russian oligarch, and crashed headlong into the restaurant's massive walk-in stone hearth. Crack! The Emperor cheese split perfectly in twain, its internal weather systems dissipating in a puff of pungent air. The sheer force of the impact finally dislodged the sieve of doom, sending it clattering across the flagstones. It came to a rest against the fireguard, its malevolent glow flickering weakly among the ashes. Klaus picked himself up slowly. He brushed a dusting of soot from his braces, retrieved Hildegard the cast-iron skillet from where he had tucked her into his belt, and cracked his knuckles. "Right," he said, stepping over the ruined halves of his inheritance. "Let's see how you handle a proper flattening." The sieve scrambled. There was no other word for it. It skittered across the flagstones on its rim, runes flickering in desperate, strobing patterns. "Wait, we can negotiate," it babbled, bouncing off the leg of an overturned table. "I'll sieve gently, recreationally, only flour, only when asked." Klaus advanced with the steady, implacable gait of a glacier with a grudge. Hildegard swung gently at his side. The restaurant's clientele had not moved. A woman in a fur-trimmed ski jacket was filming on her phone. A man in a cashmere turtleneck had fainted into his raclette. The oligarch was on the floor behind an upturned banquette, speaking rapid Russian into a satellite phone. "You sieved my flour," Klaus said. "A misunderstanding. You broke my window. Ventilation improvement. You sieved the spots off Muller's cows." The sieve hesitated. Even it knew there was no spinning that one. "Those spots were irregularly distributed," it offered weakly. Klaus raised Hildegard. The firelight caught the skillet's black iron surface and it gleamed with the dull, honest authority of cookware that had never once been described as non-stick. The sieve made a break for it. It shot upward, aiming for the restaurant's ornate copper ventilation hood. Freedom, open sky, a world of unsieved particles waiting to be processed. It never made it. Klaus threw. Hildegard spun through the air in a perfect flat rotation, not end over end, but level, as a weapon designed by someone who understood that cooking and violence were, at their core, the same discipline. She connected with the sieve at the apex of its desperate climb. Clang! The sound was final, biblical. The sieve folded, not cracked, not shattered, folded, a metal flower closing for the last time. It dropped from the air in a lazy spiralling descent and landed on the hearth with a sad, tinny plink. Its runes guttered once, twice. "I could have sieved the stars," it whispered. Then nothing. Klaus walked over, bent down, his knees delivering a symphony of protest that lasted a full 4 seconds, and picked up the crumpled sieve. It was warm, inert, just iron again. He turned it over in his hands, studied the faded Gothic lettering on the handle. Sieb des Untergangs, sieve of doom. He snorted. "Doom," he muttered. "You couldn't doom a rice pudding." He tucked the flattened sieve into his belt, retrieved Hildegard from where she'd clattered to rest against a breadbasket, and surveyed the devastation. The restaurant was, by any reasonable metric, destroyed. Half a Kaiserkäse smouldered in the fireplace. The other half had come to rest against the bar, where it was gently melting onto a collection of single malts. The carpet was ruined. The chandelier was hanging at an angle that suggested it had given up. A waiter stood frozen in the corner, holding a pepper mill the size of a mortar shell, and recalculating his entire career. Klaus looked at him. "Kirsch," he said. "Neat. And whatever's left of the cheese, on toast." He sat down heavily at the only undamaged table, a two-seater by the window with a small vase of artificial edelweiss. Outside, the sun was fully up now, painting the Verbier rooftops in clean golden light. Down the promenade, a trail of destruction stretched back up the mountain, flattened saplings, scattered marmots, one very confused postbox, all the way to the ragged hole in the side of Zum Alten Firs. The waiter, operating on pure Swiss hospitality autopilot, brought the kirsch. Then, after a moment's hesitation, a small plate of toast made from the only surviving bread in the kitchen, topped with a curl of melted Kaiserkäse, scraped reverently from the bar. Klaus bit into it. He chewed slowly. He closed his eyes. "Not bad," he said, which from Klaus Gruber was the highest compliment the Emmentaler or indeed the universe had ever received. Outside, in the wreckage of the promenade, a single spotless Simmental cow wandered past the shattered restaurant doors, mooing with quiet existential bewilderment. Klaus ignored it. He was busy. He had toast to finish. The end. Thank you for listening to The Old Man in the Alps and The Sieve of Doom, written by Lefki Karantoni. If you'd like to explore more of her work, visit www.lefkikarantoni.com.